Hello and welcome to the first episode of The Global in the Granite State for 2025, a program of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. I am Tim Horgan, your host for this series, as well as the Executive Director of the Council. I am honored to have you join us for another important global discussion, building off our record year in 2024. For those who do not know, the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire is a community-driven organization that dedicates its work to providing platforms for informed, civic discussions of global issues. As a nonpartisan nonprofit membership organization, we look to our global community to ensure these engaging programs continue to highlight key global issues. Thank you to all of our members, donors, and supporters for providing critical resources. If you have not yet had the chance to support this work, please visit wacnh.org today to show the value you find in what we do. A special thank you to our series sponsor, McLean Middleton, for your long-standing support of this and other council programs. We appreciate your community leadership and commitment to global understanding. McLean Middleton is one of New England's premier full-service law firms with over 100 attorneys throughout offices in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. McLean Middleton's attorneys have been providing trusted legal services to businesses throughout the region for over 100 years. Learn more at mclean.com. Now, help me welcome back longtime friend of the show, Sawar Kashmiri. One of the pacing challenges of the day in U.S. international relations is the complex relationship between the United States and China. Depending on who you ask, this equates to a competition, a conflict, or it poses an existential threat to the world order, one which will reshape the geopolitical landscape based on the outcome of the many thousands of decisions made in the coming years and decades. Several people believe that the outcome is predetermined, confident that these two countries are on an inevitable downward spiral towards military conflict, with one side destined to come out as the sole superpower. However, when you broaden the spectrum of voices, mainly from outside the United States and China, you can gain new insights, perspectives, and understandings on what faces the world. That is what Sawar Kashmiri, a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Association and host of the Polaris Live web series, set out to do with the fourth installment of his Telegram reports on U.S. and China relations. The latest installment, released through the Foreign Policy Association on December 15, 2024, compiled insights from 16 global leaders from 8 different countries on why it is important to get this relationship right.
I believe that the relationship is now in a period of structural, strategic competition, if I may call it that. I don't see, unless there are enlightened moves by both sides to take the initiative, any particular change. And I think it remains to be seen how the new administration gets going, but let's keep our fingers crossed.
As the two countries work to manage a new relationship, with the return of President Trump to the Oval Office, many continue to define this relationship as a new Cold War, one that the United States, or China, depending on your perspective, must win. A quick online search of the term New Cold War returns thousands of results, indicating the hold that this idea has taken in the global discussion. However, not everyone agrees that this must be the case.
In a way, I suppose you can call it a Cold War, but I think there are major differences which preclude it from being described completely that way. If you take trade, for instance, on which a country's economy, exporting country's economy depends, the best year of trade with the Soviet Union, we do in roughly 3 minutes with China. As Senator McCain famously described the Soviet Union, he called it a bankrupt gas station. It was a very apt description. But when you switch now the focus to China, we now have a huge economy, the second largest in the world. The CIA calls it the largest because they count it in a different way. with a population, with an economy, with a per capita income that the Soviet Union could only dream about. And so, in that respect, it's very different. That for the first time, the United States looks at a power, a world power that is nuclear armed, is galloping along, although there have been some hiccups in the last few months, and is now eyeball to eyeball with the United States. America has never had that kind of an experience before, and I think that that adds to some of the complication and is also why the Cold War analogy isn't completely correct.
So, whether we call it a Cold War or not, one thing is for certain. Neither side has shown much interest in building a collaborative environment on the biggest issues separating the two countries. That does not mean that there's been no cooperation. However, it will remain a bumpy ride for many years to come. Now, just because the road won't be perfectly smooth, that does not mean it has to end in catastrophe. It does mean, however, that both governments must do their best to manage the relationship, and here are a few reasons why.
Well, let me start with a very ordinary example, if I may. You know, it's Christmas time, holiday time. We're all going out and buying ornaments. Some people decorate their whole house, right? I wonder what the feeling would be towards any administration that is in power if those $1.99 trinkets that we put on our Christmas trees costed $23 next year. I was speaking at a military installation not long ago, and I went to the gift shop to buy some clothing as souvenirs. I couldn't find a single garment or a single football or a single anything that was not made in China. So when I opened my talk, I said, we need to be very careful about distancing ourselves from China because if we should ever break, heaven forbid, your gift shop is going to be totally empty. Then the fact is, both of us have in excess of 500 nuclear weapons that can be thrown at each other's capitals, right? The US is about 3,000, China has about 500 or so. But a dozen of these can end civilization. Are we going to go there? Can we ever go there? Well, if we do, then we don't have anything to worry about anyway, right? Because we're gone, excepting the cockroaches, nobody's left. So that's another prism through which you can see it. Then finally, I might say that we've tried very hard to stop China from growing, from competing, but it hasn't worked. China has raised 800 million people out of poverty. They have the largest population in the world, the largest number of patents in the world, and I can go on and on and on. Everyone has been trying to go full speed to develop the so-called quantum computer, which is the next generation of computing machinery. China has one running. They don't have the chips to make it the fastest, but they have a quantum computer running. It's a private enterprise. And the first thing they did was open it up to the entire world to test because they figured they could cut their development time down by orders of magnitude. They'd never be able to tell everything that they should. But so they opened it up. And the largest number of sign ins were from the United States. So there are all of these things that are happening. And if I might end this monologue by saying that at one time, America used to be the champion of winning hearts and minds of people around the world. That's a role that we've ceded to China.
We here at the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire have held many conversations on how China is perceived to come with funding for projects, while many think the United States only comes with lectures. It is a tough needle to thread, but the U.S. can certainly do a better job of supporting growth and development around the world. Anywhere on the global stage where the United States cedes leadership, countries like China, Russia, India, and others will fill the void with a focus on their own interests.
Well, that's something that I think our statesmen, our diplomats have grappled with for quite some time. I want to use the Ukraine-Russia war to illustrate a point. Having described this war as a war between authoritarianism and democracy, American statesmen were rather perplexed to find out that a large part of the world, 80% of the world, does not support the sanctions because they do not believe that it is a war between democracy and authoritarianism. And I include the largest democracies in the world in that group: Malaysia, Indonesia, South Africa, India, the largest democracy, Pakistan, and you can go on and on and on. So there is a need in my opinion, of a dramatic change in how the State Department analyzes, views, and filters aid. The fact of the matter is, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the master plan for Chinese help to other countries, right? There were 40 or 50 countries that were part of it. Today, there are 130. So there is something very seriously wrong. We need to sit down, analyze that, come to different conclusions than we have been. What they are, I can't tell you. But I think, as many people say, we need to be minding our own business. There are limits beyond which we can't let people go. But I think this whole definition of authoritarianism and democracy needs to change. Either that, or we're going to be in number two forever.
It may be the case that the US does selectively choose when to push the democracy and human rights angle with certain countries and issues in a way that it does not with others. Take a look at countries like India, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Rwanda, etc., when its interests are aligned one way or the other. However, this opens the government up to claims of hypocrisy, making an already challenging geopolitical landscape even harder to manage. So, in order to continue to build a better world, to solve some of the most complex geopolitical issues of our day, and to avoid a potentially catastrophic nuclear war, at the worst end of the spectrum, it is more important than ever that these countries find a way to coexist and even work together in some cases. It is impossible to know where this is headed, but with the Trump administration set to take office, now is a good time to review what the path forward might look like.
Once a year, we put out the telegram. But now, with the new administration coming in and very little movement in the most consequential relationship in the world, which is what a lot of us call it, we thought that there needs to be a new telegram midway between the next telegram and see if we can talk to people from different parts of the world with different perspectives and ask them just one question for the report. And that question is, if you found yourself alone with President Xi Jinping and then with President-elect Trump, what might you whisper in their ear to improve the relationship? Specific recommendations to improve the relationship between the US and China. That was the question. And we talked to people from Indonesia, Malaysia, China, United States, Germany, France, and put this report together. So it is a distilled version of what these people would recommend to both the president-elect and the president of China to improve relations between the two. And it's very, very fascinating what came out of it. And that's the report. It was just released a few days ago, so it's very fresh, just making the rounds. And it's got a rather, you can either call it brave or you can call a spunky title. It's called Make the US-China Relationship Great Again.
You can find a link to the full report in the episode description. While none of the people polled in these conversations have direct lines of access to either president, they do represent a wide and diverse set of political views, which can give insights into the complex thinking that all sides must consider. It is an important document in that it gains perspectives from people outside the relationship, which can provide more clarity than those entrenched in a particular mindset. So, what, if any, were the trends seen in this report?
I think the umbrella takeaway was painted by former Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel, who was one of the people who was kind enough to talk to us. He said, we need to keep talking. We need projects that we can undertake with China so that there's ongoing communication. But we need projects where neither side believes that the other will get any strategic advantage. And he said, and then we just keep going. No matter what, we need to keep talking. Now, that was followed up by Chris Fenton, who is a businessman in Los Angeles, who has spent about 20 years doing business in China, which means getting licenses, starting, and he was in the movie business, so he had a very, very delicate role that he played in China because, as you know, they exert more control than we do. And Chris said the same thing Mr. Hagel had referred to. He said, I don't care how the two do it. They might take some hits, each one, but they have to keep talking. He said, there's nothing more important than keeping talking.
As we all should know, the key to any successful relationship is clear communication. although that can sometimes be the hardest thing to achieve. This is particularly true when it comes to actual red lines for each country, such as the status of China's territorial claims in the South China Sea or the United States' increasing security cooperation with India. Avoiding mistakes and misunderstandings is important if both sides want to avoid disaster. The severing of military communication lines in the wake of the Chinese balloon that traversed the U.S. before being shot down over the Atlantic was a dangerous move, particularly as China ramped up military operations in the Taiwan Strait. A lot can be avoided if both sides are open and clear on their intentions, building trust between governments. Another interesting comment from this report focuses on the missed opportunities and duplication of efforts that go on as these two countries compete.
A professor at the Joint Forces College in Florida, Peter Cloutier, he had a very simple but remarkably, if I may say, imaginative suggestion that he would make. He said, China and America have gotten rid of tuberculosis, TB, which is an awful respiratory ailment. So, although China and America have gotten rid of it, 100 million people get impacted every year with TB. He's made a study of it. He served in Africa, he served in Latin America, and he says that the UN did a project to figure out what it would cost to eliminate TB from the world. The UN estimates that it would take an additional $6 to $7 billion to get rid of TB. And he said, what a great project that would make for America and China to work together. I mean, $7 billion a year is like a rounding error. If you take that these two countries have 44% or 45% of the world's economy. And so here's a really interesting project that came out just because we said, let's talk to everybody who's got some experience in this. So 100 million people can be saved every year, next to nothing if these two came together. And as Secretary Hagel said, there isn't a strategic advantage that either would get.
Other areas that the two countries could have major impacts on, if they so choose, include reducing greenhouse gases, drafting regulations for safe research into artificial intelligence, transnational criminal activity, the drug trade, and more. Now, we need to be clear-eyed in the assessment here. There are simply some things that China and the US may never see eye to eye on. Each country has its own national interests, and each wants to pursue its own path on these issues, most notably the status of Taiwan. Again, this is another topic we have covered extensively in other programs, but it is so important that these aspects of the relationship are properly managed. Communication here remains key, but each country will continue to stand up for what it believes is the right path forward. Another area of disagreement may well be in the trade space, with China continuing to focus on export-led growth and the United States taking a more protectionist stance. Not allowing these issues to stand in the way of opportunities for collaboration should be a priority for each government. We've talked about the relationship from the US and China perspective, but notably, thought leaders from several other countries weighed in for this report. So, what is top of mind for people such as Dr. Jenka Ortel from the German Marshall Fund, who clearly stated the main interest for the European Union at this point remains the security of member countries, and that a deterioration of relations between the United States and China will threaten Europe. She also wanted to make it clear that, quote, the support to Russia and the support for the Russian invasion of Ukraine is something that deeply violates European security interests, and thereby forever changes the relationship between Europe and China. She goes on to note that this view reflects the reality of the EU-China relationship, regardless of anything going on between the US and China.
Yes, and actually, there's a very important point that lies just below the surface on this. China and the European Union were about to sign a very important export intellectual property agreement. In the middle of that, the Europeans came out very strongly on some points that they saw China doing that they didn't believe need to be done by normal quote unquote countries. And they made that public, that they were really ticked off at what had happened. I won't go into the details of that. In return, China clamped down on all 4 feet and banned a number of the people who had negotiated this painlessly from entering China or being covered by the Chinese.
The issue Sawar is mentioning here is a sanctions fight that the EU and China got into when the European Union sanctioned, in coordination with the United States and Canada, 4 Chinese individuals and one entity, quote, connected to the reported mass detention and persecution of the Uyghur ethnic minority in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. China retaliated the same day by sanctioning 10 people in the European Union and 4 entities there. Read the European Parliament's report on the incident by clicking the link in the episode description.
And I believe what Dr. Ertl wanted to say, although she is a diplomat herself and didn't want to put it very openly, hey, listen, China, we know things are getting tough between you and America by the day. We want to develop a somewhat independent profile, but you've just knocked out all the underpinnings by coming down so hard on our diplomats. And I think what she was saying was, can we do something here to throw us a fig leaf so that we can continue on this track of thinking what we might do to develop a more independent, not totally reliant profile compared to the US? And that's what her statement was, that, listen, China, can you give something to the European Union? Anything. She was almost pleading in that sentence. That's where that came from. So this whole area of the European Union, what profile will they develop? What policies will they develop? How far away from the routine backing of everything American will they do? This is something new, I believe, that came out of this report also.
Another interesting aspect that came up a couple of times in these responses focuses on the power of people-to-people exchanges, with Flora Huang of the United Kingdom and Elena Noor of Malaysia indicating that the resumption of these programs would help to build relationships between people, the government, and the countries. I mention this as the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire wholeheartedly endorses the power of citizen diplomacy to change the world. Through our hosting of hundreds of up-and-coming leaders from around the world each and every year in our state, we see firsthand the magic that these interactions create. There's no better way to understand a country and its people than to visit it, dive into the local culture, and engage with everyday people. Sawar builds on this idea of understanding through language.
It really doesn't help the cause that there are 400 and some odd American students who are studying in China, and there are about 11,000 Chinese students studying in America. It also doesn't help the cause that most Chinese officials, especially at the policymaking level, can speak and understand English fluently. But on this side, there are very few people that can do that, speak Chinese well enough to understand policy reports, manuals, and so on. Interestingly, from everything I've been told, the diplomats who worked under Mr. Biden, there was a step change in that function, that there were more people who spoke Mandarin than have ever been before. So that is coming along. I talk at West Point frequently, and in the 10 years or so that I've been doing that, there have been more people that I've seen who are taking Mandarin than were before. So that is changing, but I mean, we need to supercharge that.
The better we can understand each other, the better we react to signals, understand cultural nuance, and the less likely we are to misinterpret meaning. However, that may not be enough when the relationship is as tense as it is now. If you want to see the worst in the other side, no amount of fluency, linguistic or otherwise, will prevent you from seeing it. So, without the benefit of the proverbial crystal ball, what might we see happen in the relationship between the US and China as both sides prep for a return to the Oval Office by Donald Trump? Do we see any trend lines forming based on the first Trump presidency and the comments he has made during the campaign?
The trend line started to curve a bit just a couple of days ago, when President-elect Trump invited President Xi Jinping to his inauguration. Few expected that. I think most people believed there would be an unexpected move, but no one really believed this. Now, why do I think that this is a really important bend in the curve? Is I'd like us to think back to when President Nixon traveled to the Soviet Union and opened up that beginning of the end of the Cold War. And the reason I often think about that is that think about that time the Vietnam War was going on. We were plastering Vietnam with bombs. American prisoners of war were in Vietnam. The Soviet Union was on the Vietnamese side. You couldn't think of a more damaging moment for an American president, a conservative American president, to travel to Russia, to travel to the Soviet Union, right? But he saw what was happening, the competitive forces that had been unleashed, and he took that gamble, and look at what it did. And I see what Mr. Trump has just done in kind of the same light, that it is an unexpected flanking movement. And I was thinking about it last evening before I stopped thinking about work. And my thought was Mr. Xi Jinping ought to take him up on it. But I believe he should take him up on it with a condition. And the condition is a visit in the first 30 days of the presidency to China. My feeling is that it will be very difficult for him to justify to the Chinese people that this is not him kind of crawling over, as Mr. Trump described Mr. Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, doing when he came down. So I think this is a very, very important move that he's made. I don't think this is one of the, oh, let's go do something today move that Mr. Trump is known for. I think this is a very serious move. And I really do wish that Mr. Xi Jinping responds accordingly with whatever conditions he needs to put into place so that he doesn't appear weak to his people. So we need to think of where we've come from, where we are, and take a deep breath and do things that we've not thought of before. And in this case, if I may, I will applaud Mr. Trump for what he's just done. I only hope he follows through when Mr. Xi Jinping suggests a compromise so that he can come.
Now, at this point in time, it does not appear that Xi will take him up on his offer, nor will any other world leader, but only time will tell. No world leader has attended a U.S. presidential inauguration in the past, so this would be historic if it does come to pass. However, one invitation, unfortunately, does not necessarily signal a shift in tone or understanding of a relationship. On the other hand, there have been some interesting shifts in Trump's approach to the bilateral relationship, with a softening of his stance on a TikTok ban to recent comments made by Trump indicating he believes that he and Xi will get along well. So, while no one really knows where this will all head, it is clear that this is one of the relationships that requires special attention and care.
I believe that things are at a crossroads at this point, and that both countries need to be very, very careful that it doesn't blow up in their faces. So I'm glad we did this report. I'm glad and thank you for having me on your show so I could tell you about some of the highlights from the perspective of people around the world. I wish I could end on a happier note and say, oh, we've done a report that everyone is going to hold up and go marching off into peace and glory. Well, that's not going to happen. It wouldn't happen from our report anyway, at least hopefully it'll move the needle a centimeter. But I can't give you a yes on that. I think that things are not rosy, and I think they're not overblown. I think what is overblown is the capacity of people to think along lines and move the needle the other way. But it's a very tense time, and it's a very difficult time, and it's a very dangerous time.
Thank you to Swar for his insights into this ever-changing and consequential relationship. I would highly recommend reading through the fourth iteration of the Telegram series that was released on December 15, 2024. You can find a link in the episode description to see for yourself the insights and opinions that these important foreign policy leaders have outlined. While many of them do not have optimism for the future of the relationship, it is important and heartening to know that there is a positive path forward and that many people are working on charting that better path. And thank you to you for listening to this episode of The Global and the Granite State, a program of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. We hope you found it insightful and that it has helped to make some sense of this complex relationship. Keep an eye out for future programs on this evolving challenge. as we all navigate the next several years. As always, Tim Horgan is the producer, director, editor, audio engineer, fact checker, and everything else to this podcast. Our theme music remains Admin by A. Alto, and our interlude music is Competition Music by Ivan Travesso. Join us next month to dive deep into the top geopolitical issues of the day.